In 1966, Robert Paine proved that removing a single predator could collapse an entire ecosystem in 12 months. And in 2024, Apple became the first company to hit $3 trillion by doing the exact opposite. The strategy is identical, and only the kingdom is different. Paine worked as a marine biologist at the University of Washington, and one day he walked onto Mukkaw Bay in Washington state and started ripping starfish off rocks. This wasn't random destruction, but systematic removal, because he wanted to know what happens to an ecosystem when you take out its most aggressive hunter. The species he targeted was Pisaster ochraceus, the purple sea star, and within a year the mussels had taken over everything. Barnacles disappeared, seaweed vanished, and 15 species collapsed into 2. What Paine discovered became known as the keystone species concept, and his paper, Food Web Complexity and Species Diversity, has been cited over 5,000 times since its publication, making it one of the most influential ecology papers ever written. And here's why that matters to you. Apple isn't a technology company, and what it actually operates as is an apex predator. Once you understand predator ecology, you'll never look at their business decisions the same way again. Most people think Apple succeeds because of good design, beautiful products, and premium branding. Warren Buffett calls it a moat, but that's like saying a great white shark succeeds because it has nice teeth. The teeth are just the output, and the real story is the hunting strategy, the ecological position, the way the entire organism is optimized for a specific type of dominance. What Buffett recognizes intuitively, biologists mapped decades ago, because Apple's moat isn't a business strategy at all, but apex predator territorial behavior. Biologists have spent decades studying apex predators, and the playbook they've uncovered maps onto Apple's behavior with eerie precision. This isn't metaphor, but structure. The same principles that explain why wolves transformed Yellowstone explain why Apple kills products you love, and the same mathematics that predict cheetah hunting patterns predict which markets Apple enters. In any ecosystem, you have what biologists call trophic levels, which is the technical term for who eats whom. Plants convert sunlight into energy at the bottom, herbivores eat plants, predators eat herbivores, and at the very top sit the apex predators. These are animals with no natural enemies above them, like lions in the savannah, orcas in the ocean, and wolves on land. What makes an apex predator isn't just being dangerous, because lots of animals are dangerous. What makes an apex predator is occupying a position in the food web where you control the entire system below you through selective pressure, and that's where Paine's research gets interesting. His work, along with the decades of study that followed at Yellowstone, revealed something that nobody expected. Apex predators don't just kill to eat, they kill to shape. They engage in what ecologists call trophic cascades, where their hunting behavior ripples down through every level of the ecosystem, changing the behavior and population of species they never directly touch. When wolves returned to Yellowstone in 1995, something happened that nobody predicted, and that something was the river's changing course. This is the most studied trophic cascade in history, documented in over 300 peer-reviewed papers. Because wolves hunted elk, the elk stopped grazing in valleys where they were vulnerable, and vegetation recovered on riverbanks as a result. Roots stabilized the soil, erosion patterns shifted, and the rivers physically moved. Predators reshape the landscape itself. Now think about Apple, and think about what happens to markets when Apple enters them. Think about what happens to competitors, to standards, to entire product categories. The rivers move. What Apple does to technology markets is structurally identical to what apex predators do to ecosystems. The mechanism is the same, the mathematics are the same, and only the materials differ. In ecology, there's a concept called optimal foraging theory that Eric Charnov developed at the University of Utah in the 1970s. It describes how predators don't hunt randomly, but instead make calculated decisions about energy expenditure versus caloric return. A cheetah's chase success rate sits at only 58%, which means they can't afford random pursuits because every failed hunt costs roughly 1,200 calories. They identify the optimal target based on distance, terrain, the prey's health, and the energy cost of the pursuit. Apple's product launch success rate under Tim Cook exceeds 90%, and that's the same calculation with different calories. Apple doesn't enter every market, but instead identifies markets where the energy-to-return ratio is optimal. MP3 players existed for years before the iPod. Smartphones existed before the iPhone. Tablets existed before the iPad. Smartwatches existed before the Apple Watch. And wireless earbuds existed before AirPods. Apple waited and watched the ecosystem, identified the prey worth chasing, and then struck with overwhelming force. This isn't patience, and it isn't strategy in the traditional sense. It's predator optimization. The mathematics are identical, and Charnov could have written Apple's product roadmap. The first principle is territorial behavior. In predator ecology, apex predators maintain territories that cover not just where they live, but where they hunt. A wolf pack's territory in Yellowstone averages about 185 square miles, and they mark their boundaries using urine containing over 100 distinct chemical compounds. Each molecule communicates claimed, and they patrol constantly. What's critical is that they attack and kill other wolves who enter their space, not as aggression for its own sake, but as resource defense. Every competitor in your territory is competing for your prey. Apple's ecosystem functions as a territory where the wolves aren't physical but chemical in a sense. Proprietary APIs containing authentication signatures communicate the same message. Wolf urine communicates at the molecular level, which is that this space is claimed. iMessage, AirDrop, iCloud, Handoff, and the seamless integration between iPhone, iPad, Mac, Watch, and AirPods don't function as features. They function as boundary markers. Every service that only works within the Apple ecosystem acts as a scent marking, and every proprietary protocol acts as a chemical compound saying claimed. Google's Android exists outside this territory as an open savanna where different ecological rules apply, and Samsung roams there alongside Xiaomi and OnePlus. That's a different biome entirely. Inside Apple's territory, the walls aren't just high, they're patrolled. And that's when you see what happens when competitors enter Apple's hunting grounds. When Spotify grew large enough to matter, Apple launched Apple Music and gave it preferential placement on every device they control. And Spotify's complaint to the European Commission documented this territorial aggression in detail. When Tile dominated Bluetooth tracking, Apple launched AirTags with ultra-wideband chips and integrated Find My network access that Tile structurally couldn't match. When Pebble pioneered smartwatches, Apple launched the Apple Watch and systematically limited what competing watches could do when paired with iPhones. Pebble is dead now, and the territory remains defended. This is classic apex predator behavior, where the goal isn't necessarily to kill the competitor, but to limit their access to the prey base within your territory. Spotify still exists, and so does Spotify's user base outside Apple's territory, but inside the Apple ecosystem, Apple Music has every advantage. The prey stays inside the walls. Biologists distinguish between two types of competition called exploitation competition and interference competition. Exploitation competition happens when you outcompete others by consuming resources faster, while interference competition happens when you directly prevent others from accessing resources at all. Apex predators use both, and Apple uses both. The App Store fees represent exploitation competition because Apple takes resources from every transaction. 30% of every app sale, 30% of every in-app purchase, and 30% of every subscription in year one. Apple's services revenue hit $85 billion in 2023, and that's the extraction layer. The restrictions on sideloading, on alternative payment systems, and on NFC access for competitors represent interference competition. You're not just out-competing, but blocking access entirely, not just hunting faster, but keeping other predators out of the hunting grounds. But here's the thing. That's not even the most important principle. The second principle is mesopredator release. And this is where Apple's strategy becomes truly sophisticated, and where most analysts completely miss the biological logic. When apex predators disappear from an ecosystem, something counterintuitive happens. You'd expect prey populations to explode, and sometimes they do, but more often the species that explodes is the mesopredator, which is the mid-level predator that the apex predator was keeping in check. Remove wolves and coyotes take over, which is exactly what happened when coyote populations in Yellowstone surged after wolves were exterminated in the 1920s. Remove lions and leopard populations surge. These mesopredators then devastate prey populations and destabilize the entire system in ways the apex predator never did. Apple understands mesopredator release at an instinctive level, and they have the scar tissue to prove it. Look at what happened when Apple relaxed its control in the 1990s under John Sculley and later Gil Amelio. They licensed the Mac operating system to clone manufacturers, allowed fragmentation, and let mesopredators into the territory. Companies like Power Computing and Motorola started making Mac clones that directly competed with Apple's hardware, and Power Computing specifically targeted Apple's most profitable customers. The mesopredators were hunting the best prey. Within years, Apple approached bankruptcy as its stock price collapsed and market share evaporated. The ecosystem was destabilizing, exactly as mesopredator release theory predicts. When Steve Jobs returned in 1997, his first major decision was killing the clone program, which meant eliminating the mesopredators and reasserting apex predator dominance. He didn't frame it in biological terms, but the action was pure predator ecology. Every decision Apple has made since then follows the same logic. Keeping the ecosystem closed, controlling the App Store, limiting repair options, and fighting right-to-repair legislation all represent mesopredator suppression. Tim Cook inherited this strategy and doubled down on it. The extraction layer grew as services revenue went from $24 billion in 2016 to $85 billion in 2023. Gross margin on services sits at 72%, while hardware margins sit at 36%. The mesopredators are feeding the apex predator whether they like it or not. Microsoft learned a different lesson and let mesopredators flourish. Android runs on Surface, Office runs on iPad, and LinkedIn operates everywhere. They chose symbiosis over dominance, which represents a different ecological strategy producing different outcomes. Microsoft's ecosystem functions as an open woodland, while Apple's functions as a walled territory with one apex predator. Neither approach is wrong because they're different ecological niches, but Apple's strategy only makes sense through the mesopredator lens. Consider the App Store restrictions that drove Epic Games to file their antitrust lawsuit in 2020. Epic's Fortnite was generating billions, and they tried to route around Apple's payment system. Apple removed them from the App Store within hours. From a traditional business perspective, Apple's 30% cut looks like simple profit extraction and greed. From an ecological perspective, it's mesopredator suppression. Every game studio, every app developer, and every subscription service represents a potential mesopredator that could accumulate enough resources within Apple's territory to become a competitor. The 30% cut isn't just revenue, but resource limitation, keeping mesopredators from getting large enough to challenge territorial control. Netflix understood this dynamic and stopped allowing in-app subscription purchases in 2018. They grew large enough outside Apple's territory that they could refuse to feed the apex predator. They escaped, but most can't. That's principle 2, and the third one is where it gets genuinely disturbing. The third principle is surplus killing. And this is the behavior that confuses people most about Apple. In nature, apex predators sometimes kill more than they can eat. Wolves have been documented killing dozens of sheep in a single night, far more than the pack could ever consume. Lions kill hyenas and leave the bodies uneaten. Orcas kill great white sharks just to extract their livers, which contain roughly 2,000 calories of pure fat, and then they discard the rest of the carcass to sink. For years, biologists found this behavior puzzling, because it seemed wasteful and inefficient, counter to optimal foraging theory. The current understanding is that surplus killing serves strategic purposes beyond immediate nutrition. It eliminates future competition, signals dominance to other predators, and depletes resources that competitors depend on. The dead sheep that wolves don't eat are sheep that won't reproduce, won't feed coyotes, and won't attract other wolf packs to the territory. Apple practices surplus killing constantly, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Think about when Apple killed the headphone jack in 2016. They didn't need to kill it because the iPhone 7 had space for it and the technology worked fine. Users wanted it, but Apple killed it anyway. When orcas kill great whites, they flip them upside down first, which induces tonic immobility, a paralysis response. The shark can't fight back, and then the orca extracts only the liver while leaving the rest to sink. Apple killed the headphone jack with similar precision by inducing a similar paralysis. You couldn't fight back because your existing headphones still worked, just with a dongle and just with friction. That was enough inconvenience to make you switch, and then AirPods captured the wireless audio market. It was precision extraction, and the carcass of wired audio accessories sank. Apple surplus killed an entire accessory ecosystem in that move. Every wired headphone maker saw their products become inconvenient overnight, while Beats, which Apple owned, was already positioned in wireless. The kill was surgical. The same pattern repeats across Apple's history. Apple killed flash support on the iPhone in 2010, and Steve Jobs wrote a public letter explaining why. The technical arguments were real, but the effect was surplus killing. Adobe's mobile strategy was devastated, Flash died, and web standards that Apple preferred took over. The ecosystem reorganized around the apex predator's preferences. They killed the CD drive in MacBooks, which accelerated digital distribution through iTunes, which Apple controlled. They killed the 30-pin connector and forced an entire industry to retool for Lightning, which Apple controlled. They killed MagSafe for years, only to bring it back when they controlled the wireless charging ecosystem. They'll kill Lightning for USB-C because EU regulation forces them to, but they've already extracted maximum value from the proprietary years. None of these kills were strictly necessary, and many users wanted these features, but each killing eliminated a competing standard, disrupted competitor supply chains, and reinforced Apple's control over what accessories and services work within their territory. The most dramatic surplus kill was Intel. In 2020, Apple announced the transition to Apple Silicon, their own custom ARM-based chips. Intel processors worked fine and were getting faster, and the relationship had lasted 15 years. Apple killed it anyway. The reason wasn't necessity, but elimination. Eliminating Intel eliminated a dependency, eliminated a potential meso-predator, and eliminated another predator's influence over their territory. The M1 chips that replaced Intel weren't just better, but represented complete ecological reorganization. Apple now controls the software layer, the hardware layer, the silicon layer, and the entire vertical stack from transistors to interface. No meso-predators, no dependencies, and no other predators' chemicals in their territory. Intel's stock dropped and their roadmap scrambled, while PC manufacturers who depended on Intel got nervous. The kill rippled through the technology ecosystem, exactly like trophic cascades ripple through Yellowstone. Apple didn't just change their own products, but changed the riverbanks. What most people miss is that surplus killing isn't cruelty and isn't ego, but ecological strategy. Every product Apple kills, every standard they abandon, and every accessory ecosystem they disrupt represents strategic elimination that shapes the environment in their favor. Apple's famous secrecy serves the same purpose. Ambush predators like crocodiles and trapdoor spiders rely on concealment because they need prey to wander close without suspecting danger. Apple's product secrecy functions identically, and competitors can't prepare for what they can't see coming. The Vision Pro launch worked as a crocodile strike because the industry knew something was coming, but nobody knew exactly what. By the time competitors could react, Apple had defined the category. What apex predator ecology teaches us is that Apple's behavior follows a unified principle. Territorial control, meso-predator suppression, and surplus killing aren't separate strategies or independent decisions made by different teams. They're all expressions of the same underlying truth, which is that Apple operates as an apex predator in a technological ecosystem, and every major decision optimizes for ecological dominance rather than individual product success. This explains things that seem irrational through a traditional business lens. Apple leaves money on the table by not licensing iOS because meso-predator suppression matters more than short-term revenue. They learned this in 1996. Apple kills beloved products with loyal followings because surplus killing shapes the ecosystem for future advantage. Apple maintains a closed ecosystem when open ecosystems often innovate faster because territorial control enables trophic cascades that benefit the apex predator. Apple abandoned the car project after a decade of investment because of optimal foraging theory. The energy to return calculation never worked, and a cheetah that can't catch the gazelle moves on. Apple moved on. Even Apple's pricing strategy follows predator logic. Premium pricing isn't just about brand positioning, but about prey selection. Apple doesn't want every customer, but wants high-value customers within their territory. Optimal foraging theory predicts exactly this behavior. Don't waste energy chasing low-value prey, and instead focus on prey with maximum caloric return. The iPhone doesn't compete for budget Android users because that would be a cheetah chasing healthy adult gazelles across open terrain instead of identifying vulnerable, high-value targets. Apple's prey is the premium customer, the user willing to pay more, who buys more apps, who subscribes to more services, and who upgrades more frequently. The territory is designed to attract and retain this specific prey while making the territory inhospitable to low-value alternatives. Here's the genuinely contrarian insight that most people miss. Conventional thinking says Apple's ecosystem lock-in is bad for consumers, and regulators in the EU think so while Epic Games thinks so. The conventional wisdom says walled gardens limit choice. Paine's research suggests something more complicated might be true. Ecosystems with apex predators have more biodiversity rather than less. When Paine removed the starfish, diversity collapsed, and when wolves returned to Yellowstone, diversity increased. The presence of an apex predator creates stability that allows more species to coexist. The App Store has 2.2 million apps, while the Google Play Store has 3.5 million, but with far more malware, far more abandonment, and far more ecosystem instability. Apple's control might create the stability that allows 2.2 million apps to exist, and the apex predator's presence might enable the ecosystem rather than just extract from it. This is what makes the EU's Digital Markets Act so ecologically interesting, because they're essentially forcing Apple to open the territory. Allowing sideloading, allowing alternative payment systems, and reducing the apex predator's control represents a real-world experiment in ecosystem dynamics. If ecology is any guide, the outcome won't match what regulators expect. Remove the apex predator, and mesopredators flourish. And that might be good if alternative app stores and payment systems benefit consumers. Or it might be Mukkaw Bay, where the ecosystem destabilizes in unpredictable ways. The biological models don't tell us which outcome is better, they just tell us that apex predator removal creates cascades. Rivers move, and nobody can predict exactly where they'll end up. And here's the final insight from ecology. Apex predators are powerful but also fragile. A sick lion is quickly surrounded, and an aging wolf is challenged by younger pack members. Apex predators can't afford weakness because the moment they show vulnerability, every suppressed mesopredator sees opportunity. Apple's legal battles with the European Union, with Epic Games, with repair advocates, and with antitrust regulators in multiple countries aren't just legal disputes but territorial challenges. Each one probes the boundary and tests whether the apex predator can still defend its position. Each one tests whether the kills are still effective. The mesopredators are watching, Spotify is watching, Epic is watching, and every company paying 30% is watching. If the apex predator weakens, they'll move. Robert Paine would tell you something important if he were analyzing Apple instead of Pisaster or Crasius. The ecosystem below Apple's position is entirely shaped by their presence, and removing them, changing them, or weakening them means nobody knows what emerges. Not Apple, not regulators, and not competitors. The trophic cascade goes wherever it goes. Next time you see an Apple decision that confuses you, don't ask what the business strategy is, but ask what an apex predator would do. An apex predator wouldn't let competitors access their territory freely, wouldn't allow mesopredators to grow unchecked, wouldn't spare potential competitors when given the chance to eliminate them, and wouldn't pursue every piece of prey but only the most valuable. The best technology strategies aren't invented in boardrooms, but discovered in systems that already work. Biology has been running optimization experiments for 4 billion years, and technology is just the latest ecosystem. The rules are the same, and the predators who understand them win. Robert Paine ripped starfish off rocks in 1966 and discovered how ecosystems actually work, while Apple discovered the same principles through trial and error, through near bankruptcy, and through competitive warfare. They converged on the same strategy from different directions. Structural truths don't care whether you discover them in a tide pool or a boardroom. Territorial control works, mesopredator suppression works, and surplus killing works. The mathematics don't change just because the kingdom does. Apple and apex predators appear completely unrelated as subjects, but the underlying principles connect everywhere. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And you'll realize that the most successful companies aren't competing on products or prices or marketing, but competing for ecological position. They're trying to become the apex predator, and if they succeed, the rivers move for everyone else.